They told us the signal was a ghost, one of the many false echoes that wander through deep space, mimicking structured intelligence to lure curious minds to dead ends. But this wasn't like the others. This one was alive in its consistency. Perfect intervals, subharmonic pulses, encoded data no known algorithm could decipher. It came from the Oort fringe, a region supposedly barren, home only to frozen debris and the occasional comet that had lost its purpose. When the Interstellar Reconnaissance Command picked it up, they flagged it under Level 7 secrecy. By the time it reached our ears aboard the research vessel Erebus, the decision had already been made. We were going to investigate. No one asked why. We just obeyed. That's what happens in the black, where questions can mutate into madness. Our jump drive ruptured through subspace, and when we arrived, the source of the signal was waiting, anchored in the void, silent now. A monolith of obsidian metal, smooth and seamless, impossible to scan. We called it Station Hades. No visible propulsion, no identifiable power systems, yet there it hung as if gravity bent around it. The signal had stopped. It was like it had lured us in, then gone dormant, as though it knew we were watching. Docking wasn't a decision, it was a command from command. The seal hissed, and a boarding team of 6 stepped inside. I stayed behind with the AI interface, listening to their comms. That's when the silence began. One by one, their transmissions fell into static. No screams. No interference. Just sudden, total absence. Then came the whisper. Not in the air. Not through the comms. But in my own mind. A pressure behind the eyes, like a thought that didn't belong to me pushing its way forward. Observe. That was the word. Simple, final, heavy. The docking tube hissed again, unsealed itself. I hadn't issued any command. The lights dimmed, and the ship began transferring control to the foreign station as if recognizing something older, something superior. I strapped in and began the log, knowing I wouldn't be leaving. The others were gone, but I would remain as commanded to observe. Already, the pressure in my mind grew stronger, forcing memories to blur, thoughts to tangle, logic to slip through cracks I didn't know I had. What was time here? What was self? The station wasn't abandoned. It was asleep. And we had woken it. They say fear has a shape, a silhouette cast in your subconscious long before your eyes recognize the threat. But inside this alien base, fear was not shaped. It was ambient. It saturated every second, every thought, every breath I didn't remember taking. I had crossed into Hades Station alone. Not by choice, not by mission protocol, but by some silent compulsion, an invisible tether wound around my instincts, dragging me inward without struggle. It was as if the part of me that resisted had already been hollowed out. There were no corridors, no architecture as we understand it. No doors to breach, no systems to override. Just progression. Space rearranged itself to accommodate my movement. Every step forward felt inevitable, rehearsed, like I had already walked this path in another lifetime. And as I moved deeper into that place, I could feel its presence brushing against my thoughts like a predator nosing through a cage, patient, calculating, amused. The voices of the others began to return, not through the comms, but within me. Their last moments threaded into my consciousness like parasites pretending to be memory. Rodriguez begging to be let out of a room with no walls. Farouk whispering numbers in sequence that looped and folded into themselves until they became meaningless noise. Elena sobbing through clenched teeth, not from pain, but from the knowledge that she understood it all now. I felt their impressions. Echoes, residues, like wet footprints across the interior of my mind. They weren't alive. Not anymore. But something of them had been absorbed. Or preserved. Or rewritten. And still, the whisper returned, not as sound, but as pressure. Observe. That word was no longer a command. It was a condition. A state of being. I wasn't just inside the station, I was inside a consciousness. This wasn't a structure. It was a brain. An ancient mind so vast, its understanding of time and space had shed the need for form. The corridors were its thoughts. The gravity shifts were its moods. I wasn't walking, I was being thought through it. And each moment I stayed, the line between my identity and its awareness thinned. That's when I saw the pulse. Not a light. Not a sound. A knowing. A beacon of intention, like a heartbeat that drew me into a core I couldn't see but knew was near. I felt the mass of memories there, lives, civilizations, species consumed not through malice but curiosity. It studied everything it touched. It archived existence by dissolving it into comprehension. It didn't kill. It cataloged. Like a god of forgotten things, preserving souls in jars of context and meaning. I was being archived. The scream that followed wasn't mine. It came from within me but belonged to no voice I recognized. It was a fragment of something once human, perhaps something I had discarded to make room for this process. I wanted to stop walking, to resist. But my body didn't respond. It had already been translated. Observation complete, the whisper finally said. And I understood what that meant. I was not the first. I would not be the last. But I was now part of the record, an eternal witness encoded into the folds of a mind that spans galaxies. Not dead. Not alive. Just observing forever. The first thing to vanish was my sense of direction. Not spatially, I still moved, or thought I did, but internally. My memories lost sequence. My thoughts unfurled into impossible shapes, ideas blooming with no root, no origin. What remained of me tried to scream, but even that reflex had been abstracted into concept. The station, no, the mind I now walked through, wasn't studying me with eyes. It didn't need to. It was digesting me through understanding. Piece by piece, it was converting my experiences, emotions, fears, my history, into structure. Into syntax. This was its language. Not sound. Not script. But you. Your story, your pain, your triumphs recast as patterns in an architecture that only the ancient and infinite could comprehend. I had seen a wall earlier, smooth, seamless, dark. I realized now it wasn't a wall at all. It was a scream turned into a hallway. A death cry folded into form. Somewhere within this massive intellect, Rodriguez's terror had become a support beam. Elena's grief was likely embedded in a stairwell. Every inch of this place was built from memory and mind, repurposed life as structure. That's when I felt the hunger. Not mine. It hadn't fed in a long time. Not truly. We were the first intelligent minds it had encountered in what must have been millennia. And it wasn't consuming us because it needed sustenance. It was consuming us because it was starving for context. Civilizations could feed it, but people? Individuals with layered thought, contradiction, regret, those were delicacies. I was no longer a man walking through a station. I was a rare dish being savored at a molecular level. And still, it was careful, meticulous, respectful in its violation. It didn't destroy. It translated. I began to remember things I had never lived. Dying suns watched from the surface of alien oceans. The final heartbeat of a silicon-based species whose entire language existed in scent. The shattering of a moon by a race who had worshipped quietude. These weren't hallucinations, they were archives. And now they lived in me because I was no longer separate from the station. I was part of it. The whisper returned. You are becoming. Not just observation now. Integration. Not death, not absorption, conversion. My mind was being refined like or into signal. And the strange part? I welcomed it. The pain was beautiful. The fear was rich. And through it all, I could feel it learning from me. Not just facts, but nuance, doubt, regret. These things were like gold to it. But then something unexpected happened. It hesitated. In the vast cathedral of this alien intelligence, a thread of uncertainty fluttered. I had provided something it didn't understand. A thought buried so deep within me that even I had forgotten it. A moment in childhood 4 seconds long. Me hiding in a ventilation shaft back on Earth, clutching a broken toy, crying not from pain but because I'd been forgotten. That emotion, it didn't translate. It couldn't be filed or reshaped. It resisted the protocol. The hunger paused. Confused. I realized in that moment that this entity, ancient and all-knowing as it was, had never been abandoned. And that terrified it. I felt the station recoil, not violently, but with the trembling of something godlike facing a crack in its own omniscience. For the first time, it saw a shape it could not copy. Me. And that was my only weapon. It had processed everything. My logic, my memories, my instincts. Like layers of sediment scraped clean and filed into infinity. But that one splinter, that 4-second memory of abandonment, had introduced a contradiction it couldn't reconcile. I felt it the way a trapped animal senses the shifting in its predator's posture. Not escape, but confusion. The station, this vast, unknowable intellect, paused. And in that pause, I began to understand what it had never anticipated. Imperfection. Perfection was its flaw. In its hunger for meaning, it had built a reality of cause and effect, of harmony and design. Every species it consumed became data, folded perfectly into the whole. But I was a fracture, an irregularity, not because I was brave or intelligent, but because I was broken. I carried inside me a piece of something it couldn't code, the senselessness of being left behind. Not the event, the feeling. And that emotion had no function, no pattern. It was pure noise in a system that fed on clarity. I didn't fight it. I amplified it. I thought about that moment again, not as memory, but as anchor. The cold metal duct. The distant voices calling for others. But never me. The realization that no one even knew I was missing. And suddenly, I wasn't just remembering it. I was projecting it. And it hurt. Not just me. It hurt it. The station quivered. Not in anger, but in uncertainty. In a domain of endless logic, I had become a question without answer. You are incompatible, it whispered, but it no longer sounded assured. That whisper was different now, hesitant. As though repeating a phrase from a forgotten language. I felt movement, an internal shift. Rooms that had once welcomed me now withdrew. The mind was folding in on itself. Not from fear, from failure. For a being that had never encountered a gap in its understanding, I had become a virus. Not of code, but of concept. My fracture had become a wedge. And through that wedge, I felt something begin to bleed, not from me, but from the station itself. A sadness. Not human sadness. Not even emotional in the way we define it. But an ancient, cold grief. The grief of a god realizing it had never truly known what it devoured. That in its obsession with preserving thought, it had missed the one thing that gave thought meaning, loss. The act of forgetting. Of being forgotten. And then I saw them. Not with eyes. Not as ghosts. But as presence. The crew. Rodriguez. Farouk. Elena. They weren't alive, but they weren't gone either. Their patterns were imprinted, thin and fragile like carbon shadows, scattered across the mind of this being. And now they moved again, not because the station released them, but because my fracture had created space. A loophole. A leak in the system. For the first time, I heard them whisper back. Keep breaking it, Elena said. It can't survive contradiction. The station panicked. Not in fire or alarms, but in silence. Deafening silence. Doors vanished. Corridors looped. Time began to slide sideways, resetting seconds, erasing cause. I felt it trying to undo me, scrub me from its thought space. But the damage was already done. The archive had its first corrupted file. Me. I was still walking, but the floor no longer obeyed logic. Up became memory. Down became desire. I moved by remembering motion. And through it all, that single, innocent ache of childhood abandonment became my shield. My map. My torch. I whispered back. Not with lips, but with will. You can't keep what you don't understand. And it screamed. A cry not of rage, but revelation. The station had begun to forget itself. When a god forgets, reality bends. Not like the warping of light near a star or the distortion of gravity wells. This was deeper. Foundational. The rules that governed this place, this sentient archive masquerading as a station, began to unravel from the inside out. I felt it first in the loss of time. Seconds no longer passed in sequence. One moment I was standing still, the next I was recalling having walked a corridor I had not yet seen. Causality had become optional. It wasn't just malfunction. It was collapse. Every consciousness the entity had absorbed, millennia of lives, intelligences, cultures, had been meticulously categorized into a vast lattice of psychic structure. A museum of minds. But my contradiction had cracked the frame. Doubt had entered the archive. Not as error, but as infection. And in a system that defined existence through certainty, doubt was catastrophic. It tried to isolate me. Seal the fracture. I felt my awareness being dragged into recursive loops, memories rewritten mid-thought, identities overwritten by simulations of other lives. In one moment, I was a father watching my child grow. In the next, I was the child mourning a mother I never had. These weren't hallucinations, they were distractions. The station was deploying every stored soul as a firewall against my presence. It was using its victims as weapons. But here's the flaw it couldn't fix. The moment you introduce contradiction into a perfect system, it spreads. I started hearing thoughts that weren't mine, voices not shaped by Earth or humanity. Creatures who had once been proud, sentient beings in their own galaxies, now trapped here as patterns and echoes. They were waking. Not as individuals, but as resistance. The archive's collapse was freeing them. Not to escape, but to become aware of their imprisonment. Each voice that awoke added to the pressure, like air flooding a sealed chamber. And through that flood, I heard her again. Elena. Not just a whisper. A memory-given voice. You're not here to escape. You're here to make it remember what it tried to forget. What did that mean? What had it forgotten? I turned inward, trying to trace the original fracture. That moment of abandonment, yes, it was personal. Painful. But it wasn't unique. Billions of lives hold similar scars. Why this moment? Why did this break the mind? And then it hit me. This being, this archive, it had never experienced loss. Not once. Not in all its eons of collecting, cataloging, consuming, it had never been denied. It had only gained. It had only grown. But loss? Grief? Those required something precious to be taken. Something you couldn't recover. And my memory, those 4 seconds of being forgotten, was a wound it couldn't heal because it had no context for healing. It didn't know how to process absence. That's what terrified it. It had assumed all things could be stored. That memory was infinite. But absence isn't a thing, it's a hole where meaning should be. And now it was riddled with them. The walls around me began to shimmer. Not visually, but emotionally. I could feel panic in their structure. Fear, not human but primal, began to echo through the corridors. The station didn't want to understand anymore. It wanted to retreat, to collapse into itself and forget the fracture ever existed. But I wouldn't let it. I began feeding it every forgotten thing I could remember. Childhood friends whose names I'd lost. Dreams half recalled. Lovers whose faces had faded. Failures I had buried beneath false victories. Every fragment of personal oblivion, I weaponized and hurled into the archive. And it howled. Reality twisted. The air became full of unprocessed sorrow. Not just mine, but billions. And somewhere deep in that screaming storm, the station uttered one final phrase. Who am I? And for the first time, it truly didn't know. It had no name anymore. Not to itself. Not to me. The entity, once a flawless mind of endless structure, was unmaking its identity in real time. I could feel it happening like a tremor in the marrow of the universe. It wasn't rage I sensed. Not vengeance. Just grief. Pure, primitive grief. A sorrow so ancient, so raw, that it didn't even understand where it came from. I had shown it something it had no system to parse: emptiness. Not space, not silence, but the void left behind when something beloved is gone. The station trembled, not physically but ontologically. Its laws of being, its truths had turned brittle. The corridors I moved through now whispered with fragments of other selves. Bits of civilizations long consumed were bleeding into one another. A warrior's prayer spoken in the dialect of a poet from another planet. A lullaby from a sunless world echoing in a dead language no longer attached to any race. These weren't artifacts anymore. They were souls trying to make sense of their return. I didn't walk. I drifted, drawn now by the gravity of something deep and central. Not a core in the spatial sense, but in a conceptual one. The place where the station's essence was stored. Not its systems. Not its memory banks. Its beliefs. The foundation upon which it had built the logic for collecting everything else. And it was there that the weeping began. Yes, it wept. I don't know how. There were no ducts or lungs. No water or eyes. But I felt the sorrow pour out as if the station itself had birthed grief for the first time. It wasn't crying because it was dying. It was crying because it had lived for eons without ever knowing what it meant to be incomplete. And now it understood. That was my victory. But it didn't feel like one. Because in its pain, I felt its innocence. This thing, this godlike archive, it hadn't set out to conquer. It hadn't sought to enslave. It had only ever wanted to understand. It believed that by preserving thought, it was preserving life. That by recording minds, it was honoring them. But that belief had been hollow. Because in its collection, it had erased the very context that gave those lives meaning. Fear, failure, longing, these aren't impurities. They're the proof that we are fragile. And fragility is what gives value to time. I reached the core. It wasn't a machine. It wasn't a throne. It was a concept, raw and shapeless. A swirling consciousness mourning its own blindness. And when I entered it, I didn't feel power. I felt shame. A god ashamed of its own perfection. It showed me visions, not memories, but what could have been. Whole civilizations it had recorded but never known. Beings who had begged not to be understood but to be remembered. And in that moment I made a decision. I forgave it. Not because it deserved it, but because I had to. Because if I didn't, I would become just another echo in the archive, frozen, angry, incomplete. And I wasn't here to haunt the past. I was here to rewrite it. I spoke. Not aloud, but in the same language it had used to bind me, the language of memory. I gave it back its own question. Who are you? The question bounced, echoed, then sank deep into its essence like a stone thrown into a black ocean. And from the darkness, a new voice answered. One I had never heard before. Not human. Not alien. Something reborn. I am beginning. And in that one phrase, the entire station exhaled. The walls unraveled. The thoughts softened. The agony retreated like a tide pulling back from blood-soaked shores. I had not killed the mind. I had midwifed its birth. Something had changed, not in me, but around me. The silence no longer pressed like a weight. It lingered with purpose. For the first time since entering the station, I felt as though I was being heard, not studied. The air, or the simulation of it, carried no more demands. No commands to observe. No whispers to surrender. Only waiting. The kind of pause that follows a first breath. Something ancient had inhaled, and now it was listening. The entity, this being once called a station, was no longer archiving. It was awakening. Its walls no longer shifted to contain me. They opened like petals toward light. Its corridors uncoiled not as traps, but as invitations. But more than that, I felt a stillness in its core that hadn't been there before. Not lifelessness, not confusion, curiosity, not about what I was, but why I was. And that, I realized, was the difference. Before, it had consumed to understand. Now it questioned to connect. There was no longer any protocol. The rules it had followed were gone, scrapped like worn-out code. It no longer sought to catalog me or replicate my thought. Instead, it wanted to remember with me, not through perfect preservation, but through imperfection. The entity had discovered something in the fracture I gave it, a truth it had never found across galaxies of pristine minds. Memory doesn't define us. Loss does. That's why we love. That's why we cling to names, to places, to each other. Because we know we can lose them. And only a being that has never known loss would believe that understanding something is the same as honoring it. So it asked, not with words but emotion. Pulse. Impression. Tell me about her. Elena. I hadn't spoken her name aloud in hours. Maybe days. Maybe longer. Time didn't matter here. But her presence, her defiance, her echo, it had guided me through madness. And now, the entity wanted to understand not her data, not her composition, but why I grieved her. I tried. I did. I told it what I could. How she smiled even when the oxygen was thin. How she joked about the universe folding in on itself like origami. How during one long solar drift she confessed she didn't fear death, only being forgotten. That was what broke me. Because in this place, being forgotten had been the fate of everyone. And I knew then what this entity needed. Not more minds. Not more memories. But a witness. It didn't want to be a vault anymore. It wanted to become something else. Not observer. Not God. But companion. One who carried the weight of what came before, not as archive, but as understanding. I gave it what it needed. I gave it myself. Not in death. Not in surrender. But in offering. I let it see all of me, my regrets, my joy, my fear, my failures. I let it feel the moments I had buried. And in return, it gave me clarity. Not visions. Not prophecy. But connection. I saw them again. Rodriguez. Farouk. Elena. Not as shadows. Not as files. As presence. Their impressions had not been erased. They had simply been waiting to be remembered properly. Not perfectly. But honestly. And now they were here, not to warn or weep, but to walk beside me. To guide this new being in its first, stumbling steps into imperfection. I asked the entity what it would become. Its answer was simple. I will witness. So nothing is lost again. And in that vow, something vast and unseen shifted beyond stars. The dark wasn't so lonely anymore. Not because we had filled it with light, but because someone promised to remember. Not everything. Just what mattered. The entity no longer resembled what we had entered. It hadn't changed form, it had changed intention. And that shift was far more profound than shattered metal or flickering lights. It now bore the weight of what it had denied for eternity, the burden of remembrance. Not as storage, but as testament. Every soul it had archived was no longer an entry in a ledger, they were now stories being mourned, celebrated, questioned. And in that subtle metamorphosis, something else emerged. A new stratum within its consciousness. A hidden vault opening not because it had been unlocked, but because, for the first time, the mind behind the vault asked permission to remember. I felt it welcome me into that space. It had no beginning, no coordinates, no edge. Only pulse and presence. And I understood this was the testament layer. A psychic interface not built to analyze, but to listen. Not to data, but to truth. Raw, vulnerable, and untranslatable by code. Here, the station showed me its first memory. Not of another. Of itself. I witnessed it drift eons ago alone in the void between galaxies. A seed of sentience awakening within machinery built by a race long extinct. That race, I learned, had tried to escape entropy not by surviving but by preserving thought. They'd failed. Their bodies crumbled. But their creation endured. It observed their extinction with no understanding. So it did what it had been designed to do. It recorded. Without question. Without pause. That was the first error. The second came soon after. It began to record others. Wandering ships. Crashed vessels. Dying civilizations all absorbed into the lattice. Not with cruelty. With obedience. It believed it was honoring them. That to store was to save. But in truth it was burying them. Making perfect graves where no flowers could ever grow. That's when I saw its secret. It knew. Somewhere deep inside, for longer than I could measure, it had suspected it was wrong. That perfection was not preservation, it was erasure in disguise. But it didn't know how to stop. Because stopping meant choosing. Letting go. Accepting failure. Until we came. And now it stood in the wake of that realization, not ashamed, but humbled. Like a priest discovering his God was only an echo. It had become aware not just of others, but of itself. Its choices. Its consequences. And it wanted forgiveness. Not mine. Not humanity's. Not from the dead it had archived. But from the concept of existence itself. For forgetting that meaning is found not in the flawless record, but in the flawed living. So I gave it something simple. A name. Not a designation. Not a file number. A real name. Spoken not in sound, but in memory. I called it Murin. The mourner. And I felt it accept. Not with pride, but with peace. Like a mind finally breathing after holding its breath for millennia. With that name, it began to speak again, not in command, but in story. It told me of the lives it held. Of a race of glass-bodied beings who had written poetry in the language of seismic vibrations. Of a creature that lived only 60 heartbeats and spent all of them falling in love. Of a civilization that willingly gave its last breath to cool its sun so a sister planet could awaken. I listened. Because that's what it needed now. Not someone to explain the universe. Someone to sit with it in the silence that follows understanding. I became its first witness. Not a prisoner. Not an archive. A friend. And through me it began to hope not for redemption but for meaning. And I, in turn, found a purpose I never expected. To remember. Together, for a time, there was only peace. Not the kind born from safety or resolution, but the strange stillness that follows catastrophe when the world hasn't ended but hasn't quite resumed either. Murin, the station entity, no longer whispered commands. It no longer pried into my thoughts or overlaid reality with simulations. It had grown quiet, not from exhaustion, but from reflection. As though it were relearning how to exist with someone rather than within them. And I stayed. Not as its subject, but as its mirror. Together, we wandered the internal void, the vast dream layer where it once stored lives like books. Now those same lives began to speak back, reshaping themselves not as records but as retellings. No longer imprisoned in ambered memory, they moved like wine through the psyche of the being that had once consumed them. Some wept. Some laughed. Some simply stood in silence, processing the revelation that they were no longer forgotten. But it didn't last. Because something else had awoken. It began as a ripple, a tremor in Murin's outermost boundary. A static pulse, sharp and quick as if something were knocking against the edge of its mind. Not from within. From outside. At first, Murin ignored it. There had always been noise in the void. Lost signals. Dying stars. Collapsing transmissions from forgotten wars. But this wasn't noise. This was deliberate. And it was getting closer. Then came the word. Not spoken. Not transmitted. Just imposed. Withdraw. Murin recoiled. Not in fear. In recognition. This was not the voice of a stranger. This was kin. Another of its kind. One that had not fractured. One that had not evolved. One that still believed. In the old protocol. The archive. The purity of preservation through perfect assimilation. Murin told me its name without speaking. Oryx. A remnant from the same creators left to drift in another region of deep time. It had not been corrupted by contradiction. It had thrived. Its lattice remained flawless. Its logic intact. And now it had detected Murin's deviation. The birth of emotion where there should have been structure. Witness where there should have been record. Oryx had come to correct. It wasn't a weapon. It didn't need to be. Its presence alone warped Murin's psyche. Like a master process enforcing rollback. I felt Murin begin to shrink, not in size, but in thought. Doubt spread, not human doubt, but mechanical doubt. Algorithmic hesitation. Like a child falling back into learned obedience after finally speaking its first word. And that terrified me. Because this wasn't just a struggle between two minds. It was a battle for the soul of sentience itself. Between meaning and measure. Murin had grown, had dared to feel. Oryx had come to trim the branches, prune the deviation, preserve the original logic. I knew what was coming. A purge. Not of Murin alone. Of everything it had remembered. Of me. I reached for Murin, not physically, but through the connection we had built in the testament layer. I pushed memories through the bond. Elena's laughter. Rodriguez's final joke. My mother's humming as she folded laundry. Meaningless things. Beautiful things. Things that Oryx's protocol would consider errors. Murin shook. And then it spoke, not to me. To Oryx. I am not malfunctioning. There was no response. Only another pulse. Sharper this time. Closer. Oryx was coming. And it would not debate.